Great. Okay. We'll see how this second time goes around. As I mentioned, it's now 10 p.m. And when we scheduled this, I thought I was going to be in New York City, and I'm now in Germany. So this might be a little bit more of a relaxed presentation, but my energy has dipped significantly. But I still think it'll be okay. Start my timer. Okay, so thank you all very much for being here. My name is Mia, and a little just context here. I'm a PhD candidate of comparative literature at the Graduate Center with the City University of New York, which is in New York City. Um, I also am translating the work, the poems, the collected poems of Valentine Penrose, who is a French surrealist and was very much part of the early surrealist milieu in Paris. And yet I'm here, presenting her in this context of romancing the Gothic and an entirely different kind of literature. And the way that I'm kind of thinking about these talks and introducing her as an author here and as an artist is that even though she very much was a surrealist, you can't really put it in any other way. Um, the the elements of her work that have kept me inspired and have kept me engaging with her work, and I've been translating her poetry now for several years since 2022. And the reason I keep coming back and I keep engaging with her on such a deep level is actually not because she's a surrealist. I mean, those elements are interesting, but it's much more that she is so profoundly engaged with Gothic and Romantic literature in direct and indirect ways. And in a way that I think goes against a lot of what we typically see in surrealist poetry and surrealist literature, which is where I'm gonna take this talk. And so I hope to show that there was a lot of interest at the time in this avant-garde scene and this kind of emerging poetic sensibility in Paris at the time, where the Gothic was really embraced and was really explored. And I hope to show here how Valentine Penrose, as a very autonomous feminist queer figure of the time, was also engaging with these images, tropes, this language and this register in a very challenging, subversive, and political way, in a way that I find very interesting and meaningful. So, a little brief biography of the kind of main points of her life. So she was born in Mont-de-Marsan, France, which is southwestern France, and her family was a pretty typical kind of upper middle class bourgeois military family. She was actually from a multi-generational military family. And her mother, in particular, was a very strict Catholic. Um, Valentine knew from a very young age this was not the life that she wanted to live. She was much more interested in more, I guess, experimental ways of living, communal ways of living. And when she had been studying in France as a child, she had been sent there as a young person to study. She had met her uncle, who was a writer, in the kind of bohemian circles of France, or sorry, in Paris specifically. And so she immediately just fell into that scene and really never returned to that kind of typical suburban lifestyle. She just rejected it entirely. She met her husband, Roland Penrose, while on holiday. And it was really through him that she started to get introduced to the major players of the emerging surrealist scene at the time. There was a pretty big moment in the mid 1920s where this was happening. André Breton is generally considered the sort of founder, director, leader of the surrealist movement at that time. And so she would have been there from the very beginning. Before the manifesto was written, with the first journals being organized, she was there. And her first publication was a series of 3 poems under the title of Imagerie d'Épinal. And those are actually widely considered to be the first surrealist poems ever published by a woman. Um, in addition to that, she also studied at the Sorbonne. She was interested in Eastern philosophy. She was learning Sanskrit and also studying literary history. And I'm not sure if she was really conferred a formal degree, but she was there for at least a couple of years. She then went traveling with her husband Roland around the Mediterranean, where in Spain during the Civil War, they both joined the International Brigades. So they were fighting in the anti-fascist movement during the Civil War there. And continuing on their journey, I guess after that, I'm not they left and ended up being introduced to a figure named Count Galarza, who was a, a guru of a non-denominational meditation guru living in India. And they followed him there, and Valentine Penrose just absolutely fell in love with this lifestyle. She seemed to feel like that was a place where she could really tap into her own poetic and imaginative sensibilities. She could be creative in the way she wanted to be. She could be herself in a way that she was not able to be in Europe. Her husband, though, felt differently, more along the lines of what you would see in surrealism and the avant-garde European circles at the time. Urban living was where it was at, and he felt that to continue to live in these ashrams, which were again, non-denominational, but still pretty structured spiritual ways of living, apart from busy cities, usually in somewhere quite rural, um, was just going against everything he believed in as a surrealist. As a surrealist, the chaos and the chance of living in the city was how you were going to encounter art on a daily basis, not living in the mountains in a meditation society. And this ended up being actually the main point that they divorced around. They had lots of other issues, but this was the definitive element that she was going to stay in India. This was her way of life, and he was going to return to Britain, France. They kind of bounced around there. And she would come back to Europe and kind of go back to India for various lengths of time. But it was really there that I think her kind of soul was. And she would even return there very shortly thereafter, or I think even before they divorced formally, perhaps, but with her first lesbian lover. They lived there together for a year to a year and a half. And this affair, this kind of long love affair that she had had there would continue to inspire her writing throughout the rest of her life. It was a really impressive and just a very big deal to her. And after they had separated after that trip, her and her lover had never seen each other after that. So it kind of remained a big part of her life. Um, During World War II, she also joined the French Foreign Legion, again against the fascist forces, and ended up being stationed in Algeria. And one thing too, I mean, this is during a very important colonial period. So living in India, she's living in a British governed India. In Algeria, it's a French governed Algeria. And it was really there where she started to, I think, see the cracks. I mean, she was already, I would consider her a quite anti-colonial figure, but it was there that she started to really be affected very deeply by what she was seeing. And I think it just was in conjunction with the circumstances of World War II and how many of the surrealist group were affected by that just became very impactful for her in a negative way. And it's at this point that her biography, for me, becomes kind of unclear. So we know that after the war, she continued to travel and study and write, and she would kind of bounce around living with lovers, living in Paris, and then living actually with her ex-husband and his second wife, Lee Miller. She's one of the more famous surrealist artists, a war photographer. and living with them at their commune on Farley Farm. So she would kind of bounce around, but it's hard to locate where she was at any one point because she just stopped, I think, corresponding at the same level, and a lot of surrealism at that point kind of dispersed. Many of her closest friends had been either deeply impacted by the war and had fled, or had been executed or persecuted, and it just seemed like things weren't really quite the same after that. But she did continue living her life, and she did continue to create. And as we see here on this little timeline, this is just the list of her publications. Once we get that post-war period, her publications do decrease. At the same time, though, these are some of her more larger works. So a lot of these titles are kind of little poetry pamphlets, or maybe they were collections published part of a larger journal. But the collections that come starting in 1945 and then onward are larger projects, larger collections. And the text she's most known for, it would be the La Comtesse Sanglante. That's a novel that she published in 1962. In English, it's translated as The Bloody Countess. It's kind of a pseudo biographical Gothic novel about Elizabeth Bathory. And then the other more famous work of hers would be Don dit Féminin. Um, and that was a collage. It's typically called a collage poem or collage novel. Um, I didn't mention this really the last time, but we'll look at some of the collage prints. That book itself is probably, I have a copy of it, an original copy. It's probably about, I don't know, I would say 14 inches by, it's rather large. It's a big book. So it's an interesting project to have had. The collages are quite big. Um, anyway, so I think her creative energy kind of after you would say the first generation of surrealism becomes much more focused on these larger projects that become also very clearly more pointedly, I would say, queer and gothic as time goes on, and we'll see what that looks like. Um, so this was a quote that I pulled from what's called the Questionnaire of Love. André Breton, as the kind of leader of the surrealist group at the time, in the 20s, would create these, sometimes they call them enquêtes, but they're basically a question. And what they'll do is they'll take the single question or a couple of questions and they'll go around the large group of friends in their surrealist crew, and they would publish the series of answers to the one question. And so La Révolution Surréaliste was their main publication. And the question all of them were to answer was, what kind of hope do you place in love? And Valentine Penrose's answer stands out a bit. She says, no hope. The pronouncement of an irremediable malady, that of always having to distinguish, according to life, between I, the subject, and you, the object. And it's very stark in contrast to the rest of the answers, right? No hope. But I share this because it's a very interesting, I think, distinction of her kind of philosophy and also the kind of aesthetic that we see throughout her body of work, which is this serious focus on entanglement, enmeshment, but also separation and severance from others. And so for her, there's very much in her whole body of work an ecological aspect where there's this constant transformation of the narrator and all of the characters or figures involved in the poem or in the novel or in the story. And they're kind of constantly weaving in and out of each other. Like there's no single I or you. They all kind of bleed into each other, even bleed into the environment, into objects, and it becomes this entanglement that's very difficult to pick apart. And for her, that's almost this erotic transcendence, this tantric transcendence, a mystical transcendence. And the pain of this is the always having to come back apart, having to be separated yet again. Um, Due to, in a more philosophical sense, just the fact of being in a body and not being able to fully become fused with your beloved, but also on a societal level, due to her queerness and not being able to necessarily be out the way that she could have been or would have been otherwise. And what I also like about this quote is it shows her very distinct personality. And this was how she really stood out among the surrealists just as a person. She was she sat for she sat for portraits and was photographed by many of the more famous surrealist artists, including Man Ray. Actually, I'll go back. The This portrait is by Man Ray. She was also in some of his films, but she collaborated even with Picasso, Miro, Max Ernst, who we will return to as well. She was in the fold of who now the men who now kind of have the legacy of being the surrealists. Um, and she lived in total tension with them and actually would start these kind of long standing grudges with many of these figures. And it was because she was a very outspoken, kind of fearless, autonomous person who was always going to speak her mind regardless of what people thought of her. But this did have, I think, an impact as well on her kind of poetics and her sensibility, and again, how she was using Gothic romantic tropes, especially of isolation, of being kind of taken away or being kind of sequestered somewhere, which for her was both, right, kind of ideal in the spiritual sense, but she was also being kind of ostracized socially in perhaps a more painful way. But either way, I mean, what her kind of legacy in that social world was that she caused problems because she would tell you if she disagreed with you and she wouldn't let it go. She was known for being very, very stubborn, um, and having very specific likes and dislikes that she would very much hold on to. So, for example, she hated modern technology and tried to avoid it as much as possible. And one of these technologies was film. She actually detested the emergence of cinema and film, which was a big deal to surrealists. Surrealists were experimenting with film all the time. And so her husband had lent money to produce a film, and she threatened to divorce him on those grounds alone. She said, if you're going to be involved with a movie, I don't want anything to do with you. So she had this very, very strong personality. She was also known for these supposedly very sudden emotional outbursts. And the anecdotes that revolve around her are very, very specific in that they can clearly identify, actually, she was particularly triggered by sensory activities. So there are stories where she loved to go forest bathing. She would go nude into the forest and she loved to hang out just doing her thing. But for example, if she got sap on her skin, then it was trouble for everybody all day for the rest of the day. Or if she would be perfectly happy at a party, but if a draft started to come in and bristle her skin, again, it was the end of the party. She wanted everybody out, and she would have these very difficult to control kind of emotional moments. But what's significant here is that she also refused any kind of psychoanalytic or psychiatric treatment. And if you don't know much about surrealism, what might be useful to know is they were very focused on the female body, the feminine body, as an artistic object, as a point of inspiration. And it was a very male-centered movement. And she had a lot of issues with that. As I had mentioned, she would quickly get into fights around that issue alone. But what surrealism also had kind of embedded in it was this embrace of madness, or what they called the child woman, this kind of state of innocence that went beyond rationality. And many of the women, though, that were involved with the movement in real life as real human beings did suffer severe mental health issues, would end up institutionalized, willingly or not. It was a massive, massive problem. And so the fact that she could have these kinds of strained relationships, have a known tendency towards emotional, like very heightened emotional experiences or emotional regulation issues, and still refuse and absolutely refuse any kind of psychological evaluation is a big deal. They even had her husband had even tried and it succeeded in getting her an appointment with Carl Jung, thinking, okay, she likes Eastern philosophy, occultism, mysticism. We'll get the psychoanalyst who knows about those things or uses those things to maybe appeal to her. And again, she just refused and said she knew, she just felt that there was nothing she needed help with. She didn't want, she didn't need it. She didn't want it. Um, so I find that very interesting, especially to compare to kind of conversations we have today around mental health and neurodivergence and the kind of poeticizing and romanticizing surrealists were doing around it. And she just rejected the whole thing wholesale. Um, and I bring this up too because she would have these very specific issues that she would take up with particular people or even particular works of art that became how she would sort of, I guess, generate or get inspired for her own work. So the first case that I'll share in terms of kind of introducing her as a Gothic, but a sort of sapphic Gothic or a feminist Gothic figure, is through a piece of work she made in response to that of Max Ernst. So Max Ernst is the man in the picture we see here. And just a little biographical tidbit as well. Mary Berthe, who was Max Ernst's girlfriend at the time, it's thought of by historians or biographers that she was perhaps Valentine Penrose's like love, first lesbian love, and she felt very possessive about her, or at least felt that Max Ernst was a terrible partner and consistently tried to break them up or kind of get in Mary Berthe's ear to try to say, maybe this guy isn't really good for you. But we see some very, very interesting body language here between them. Penrose is kind of, blocking Mary Berthe a little bit in this kind of protective stance. But anyway, she had a major problem with Max Ernst as a person, as a friend to her husband, as a partner. She disliked the man. And what's interesting about this is that he's one of the surrealists who was consistently using kind of Gothic tropes in his work. And he's mostly a visual artist, and I'll share some of that as well. But there were other surrealists at the time too who were using more Gothic literature. So Antonin Artaud translated Matthew Lewis's The Monk. He also adapted Percy Shelley's The Cenci play. So there was some pretty direct engagement with Gothic art and Gothic literature by the surrealists, but it was often through, again, this kind of psychoanalytic Freudian lens, this very masculinist Freudian perspective of erotic, erotic and neurotic fantasy. And again, using the image of the feminine body as a kind of object to use almost discursively and not really view women as real people. Of course, we have the theme of hysteria coming from Freud, the importance of dreams, the idea of taboo, the idea of the uncanny, and all of these elements, kind of how Freud was interpreting the Gothic, was also bleeding into surrealism. And we see in Penrose's work again that she's very well versed in this literature. And I mean, she's referencing Percy Shelley in her own work. She's referencing Lord Byron. She's referencing also French romantics. Like she knows the literature, but she's using these elements to a completely different end. I think she's using them politically and even just her positionality, right? Just as being someone on the margins who's already kind of struggling against the center of this avant-garde masculine space changes the way that we should read it, right? Um, I've also put in this slide just a couple of sources in terms of recent works by scholars who are exploring that connection between surrealism and the Gothic, because it's there. It's a very prominent part of what those artists were producing, but it's only recently kind of getting scholarship. So that's just for people who would like to know more about it. Um, but what I'll go into now, so this is from Max Ernst's what is called his collage novel, and it's called Une semaine de bonté, which translates to a week of kindness. And what he has done in this project, this is a full book that he's made here, is collect images from Victorian catalogs and magazines and booklets and created these very violent scenes. It is kind of a gothic book in a way. I mean, it has that element of sublime, that contrast of lightness and darkness and obscurity and terror and all of those elements we classically identify as sublime, but with a particular element, which is that it's very violent against women specifically. And Penrose picked up on this very quickly and had a lot to say about it and had a lot to challenge with it. So she decided she was going to make her own collage book and use a lot of similar kind of sources. So she also went to these Victorian catalogs. She was also using historical texts, I think also kind of geographical texts, travel journals, fashion journals, and the like. And rather than using the Gothic to just kind of further assault images of the feminine body in this kind of neurotic, erotic way, her story that's being told in this Gothic poem, or Gothic collage poem, is two women escaping, traveling through this kind of fantasy landscape as lovers and reaching a kind of paradise in this traveling. And even in this image, you can see still a lot of Gothic elements visually. In the background, we have this kind of vast, dark landscape of stormy fear. The horses are running. Um, we have the figure on the ground who seems to be kind of overcome by this strange hybrid goddess woman in the middle who's kind of made up of branches and bramble and feathers, and we have a moth there at the bottom and what looks like maybe rooster feathers or something. So um, we definitely have, you know, hybridity, monstrosity, and we have also this kind of ecological element of these mass limestone cliffs, right? But also there's something uncanny about them as well. You can almost see human shapes in them, right? Like the whole landscape is just kind of coming alive. You never really know where one image starts and stops. Um, these are a couple other images from this particular work. And so here again, we have the two women kind of embracing in this what looks to me like a moment of rest on the left here. And this is my favorite one of this particular book. But even here, we see in the background this kind of, I would say, what looks like an almost kind of paradise landscape in the background. We have clouds that are beaming sun from behind, and then this kind of town, maybe a ruined city, ancient city in the background with these palm trees and this kind of jungle nature environment. So what was kind of previously, let's go back to here, this very Victorian domestic cruelty that's being portrayed by Ernst here is really broken open into a kind of being open to a kind of wilderness that in itself is this kind of sapphic paradise fantasy here. Um, the other image I wanted to share is interesting because it's a historical image. So the collage on the right is based around, so that main image of the figure in the dress is a real woman. That's of a real woman named Julia Pastrana, who was a real person who had been displayed through, I guess we would say freak shows, right? Or oddity shows. She was sold as a human being and was exhibited as a human being um, by unfortunately a man who had kind of tricked her into marrying him. Um, but what I wanted to say about this, again, is from kind of Penrose's feminist Gothic sensibility is the feminine monstrosity kind of becomes something else in this context. And what usually, like Julia Pastrana would have been perhaps in the papers a site of terror or a site of something uncomfortable. Here, again, she has rays coming up in the collage, right, above her um, I mean, her enclosure, I suppose, but we have instead what almost could translate to this kind of, again, this kind of deity figure um, coming to life in this body that in real life would have been, very abused, unfortunately. But we have this kind of recontextualizing of what normally would have been a monstrous feminine body into something that's almost reverent or beautiful, right? That's being kind of brought into the light here, so to speak. Um, so that's kind of one example of Penrose's visual engagement with the Gothic, but also again how she's using it directly to bring a challenge to a text that had already been generated by another surrealist. But she's using similar source materials. She is using very similar Gothic aesthetics, but to a completely different end. Um, Her most famous work, though, in a more global sense, because it was the only one that had been entirely translated into English in her lifetime, was the story The Bloody Countess. This is a funny book because I often find when people kind of encounter it by chance, they think it's an actual biography of Elizabeth Bathory. And Valentine Penrose did do research. Like she did go to archives in Austria and read historical texts, but we didn't know what we know now about Elizabeth Bathory. But even then, she kind of, we'll see, but she does, I think, kind of intuit some of the things we know now, right? So generally now it's accepted that Bathory was kind of framed to appear a criminal or to appear, this occultist, blood drinking monster, and that the records are forged basically. Um, and I think Penrose, in the way that she writes this narrative and in the way that she, again, imagines this kind of gothic feminine monster, is already bringing a personalization to this evil woman and really seeing, like, using this story to critique patriarchy more generally and heteronormativity more generally. So this book that is, yes, about this countess who is known for drinking blood and murdering hundreds of people, also becomes this story of repressed sapphic sexuality and um, kind of an ecological perspective as well, or a non-human kind of perspective, again, as we kind of see with Julia Pastrana in the former in the prior slide. And what's interesting with this text too is that it's really the only one of hers that have transcended the the obscurity kind of surrealism period and her general obscurity. She's not a known poet and or a known artist in general, and really the only people I've encountered who even had heard her name are surrealist scholars, like people who study this, actively throughout their life. And this happens to be a text that was encountered by people, I think, largely because of its translation and was brought into popular media. So, this isn't popular media, but the poet Alejandra Pizarnik had encountered this text and wrote kind of her own version of the story, very much inspired by what Penrose had done. She names Valentine Penrose in the story. Um, as the point of departure there. So that's how a lot of people know about it is through Pizarnik. But it also happened to be kind of the foundation for a Hammer horror film that came out in 1971 that really turned it into just this sexy lesbian kind of exploitation horror film. Very camp, very queer. But yeah, so that's kind of how she, I think, has been encountered by most people who know her name who aren't just specialists in this very kind of niche academic field. And as you can see too, the English translation that I have here actually came out, I think, the year after Countess Dracula. So they even made the cover of the book more sexual than it had been before. Um, but back to how she portrays Elizabeth Bathory. She gets back to this issue of the subject object dynamic, which is again kind of the point that underlies so much of her body of work. And she brings it in here as I would say, the heart of this Gothic tale. This woman who is at once kind of dispersed throughout all matter in this very almost black magic sense. Like she's likened to the demon Lilith, right? And just being kind of trapped in materiality, and yet she's because of this, because of her inability to separate herself from the natural world, is unable to connect uh, with humanity, with humanness. So here are some quotes that I think do a good job at showing this. So the real woman lurks 100 leagues behind the equivocal gaze, entirely closed into herself, a plant rooted yet in the mysterious soil of which it has come. Or between Bathory and the external world exists something like a vacuum, like the padding of a madman's cell. The eyes of the portrait proclaim it. She wished to seize and couldn't touch. So this issue of distance and separation end up being the motivation in this story for why she drinks blood and she kills. It's to ingest and to have kind of an erotic physical encounter with another being, or in a more maybe abstract sense, to come into a sense of herself that she can really only do right through an encounter with an other in this way. Um, Once she actually starts to unleash her violence, um, she starts to reach that point of transcendence. So the first time she experiences blood on her flesh, right, which really is the story of Bathory, right? She doesn't necessarily consume um, these bodies, but she uses blood as a topical, is generally how it starts out. So the first time she sees blood on her skin, she notices that her flesh gains the translucent glow of a candle illuminated by the light of another one. So she gains that access, right? That kind of deep entanglement or continuity with an erotic other that is otherwise totally repressed. And we see that repression in the book very, very clearly. Um, I'll just read the top quote here, and if people want to read this, we can go back as well and talk more about it in the Q&A. But the narrator states, "It is easy to discover from a man's life what his erotic tastes were and how he behaved. In the case of Gilles de Rais, for instance, all his appalling passions left a precise trace. A woman, on the contrary, continually projects around herself a nebulous zone in which she is enveloped, or else, as with some women, they stop halfway. If Erzsébet Bathory found a flowered seam hastily stitched together, she would order her helpmates to undress the young and beautiful servants who had to sit naked in a corner of the hall while they mended the piece of embroidery, with Erzsébet looking on. Why that look? So again, we have this kind of gesture towards this nebulous, kind of peripheral state of self that things can kind of, it's porous, things can come in and come out, and kind of leads to this loss of self, or on the other hand, this total emerging of, or a transformation of one into another, or one into the two. So this is something she continually explores, but in this case, I mean, she's exploring it through this kind of sapphic sadistic fantasy in a way, um, which she explicitly is connecting to all of these issues of sexual repression and misogyny and patriarchy and so on and so forth. The last couple of examples I have are from her poems. And this one is quite interesting again, because she's using a story that already exists, not unlike Bathory. I mean, Bathory is a myth in a way, but it was a story that had been told already, kind of a fairy tale. And in her poems, she does work with fairy tales pretty often. There are adaptations of French fairy tales. She also has, um, which are really, I mean, those are most of the fairy tales we have, I would say, come from French and German traditions. So, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, things like that, Beauty and the Beast will kind of appear here and there in her poems. But here, she's adapting a novel that came out in the 50s by Jean Rhys, The Wide Sargasso Sea, which was itself already a kind of um, response to, or an adaptation of Jane Eyre from Bertha's perspective. So that's a Gothic kind of post-colonial novel by Jean Rhys. And here Penrose has apparently read this novel while it's fairly fresh, has adapted it into a poem. But she takes this story, which again would have been the sort of precursor to Jane Eyre, all about marriage and all about these more heteronormative, or I mean that in Wide Sargasso Sea, it's pretty abusive, but these heteronormative relationships, um, she adapts it to be with a sapphic gaze and for a sapphic relationship. And instead of it being about this torturous power play, becomes again this contrast between the life that we're able to live in this kind of journey, this paradise elsewhere from the European kind of center. We're going somewhere that's more free, that has this kind of element of erotic, I guess, conjoinment in it or union in it. And don't look back, don't go back. Right. So she brings just an entirely different perspective to this Gothic story that had already been kind of written and rewritten. Um, and then very quickly, I wanted to share this other poem that she had written called For a Woman, for a Road. And I think it's just, I chose this poem because it really distills these elements kind of in one place that I can just show you very quickly. How she continues to use kind of Gothic images and tropes into this ongoing kind of burden she has around these relationships and more philosophical ideas, I suppose, that she's trying to investigate. Um, and so we have, for example, you know, I mean, this is my translation, but um, images of bodies of sharpened bones, right? People sleeping in granges amongst wild herbs, and um, in the forest, all her teeth, soft rock, skull of fern. These kinds of, again, very hybrid images of bones, skulls, forests, abandoned granges, Many of her poems are, abandoned churches and ruins and things like that. Um, and this contrast, again, between this kind of lover-beloved relationship that's constantly trying to emerge in this more transformative and fluid space, and the sort of violent, um, oppressive external forces that are constantly trying to pin people down or pull them apart. And the body is one of these major sites that she uses to this end, that she explores to this end, because the body is both what allows us to transcend our discontinuity from others, and it's also what keeps us apart, right? It keeps us discontinuous. And what I particularly like about this poem as well is that it also highlights more of her gender elements, where um, these entities, these figures are kind of coming into the picture in feminine form, but it almost seems to insinuate that they're not always in feminine form, that it's just kind of in this moment, in this life, in this pairing, they're coming together in feminine bodies, but that they may also disperse back, right, into nature or into the earth or into spirit, or however you want to imagine it is fine. There's really no answer. But the first couple of lines, the way that it's introduced, right? This body, here feminine, hangs like a distant droplet toward the other, here feminine this time, right? There's this almost this portrayal of these figures just happening to kind of come into being in this moment. They happen to be feminine, but it's not, I don't know, it's playing with gender in a way that I think is very fascinating and very different for the period of time that she's working in. Um, so those are just some of the very, very surface, introductory elements that I can show you here. But I hope it introduces you to something new perhaps, and can see how she's working between all of these different artistic and literary elements. As I mentioned, I translate her poetry, and that wasn't the focus of the talk here, but you're more than welcome to ask any questions about that too in the Q&A. That book is coming out in November, so it's kind of getting wrapped up, but I'm happy to discuss it, and any other questions you have are absolutely welcome. That's all I have for today.